Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Discovering Creativity podcast. Today we have a special guest, David Cutler, and today we have this special episode where we are gonna continue talking about creativity and how can we discover all of this improvement in our daily life. My name is Dan Arroyo. David, welcome. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you for being here with us, and we are so glad that you can have this opportunity to talk with us. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation.
Well, this is great. Let's begin talking about yourself. A lot of people will be asking, who is David Cutler? So, can you give us a little bit of information about yourself, please?
Yeah, so my background is actually as a musician,
Okay.
as a pianist and a composer. Uh, and from even, when it goes to creativity, from even an early age, I was not like the other kids.
Great.
I'd be practicing my Mozart and, trying to play it like it was written, but I would be changing it up a little bit, which was not allowed, right? My own notes, my own rhythms, my own ideas on top of it. My mom would bark at me from the other room. David, that's not what it says. David, play what's on the page. But what she did not yet realize was whether because of an inherent need to be creative or maybe just a short attention span, something inside of me had to find my own voice. And it was those inclinations that originally led me in some different musical directions, like towards jazz music, where you would inherit something, a tune or a melody and some harmonies, and then you would have to find your own way to execute it, and towards composition. And so that actually formed who I became on a very early age. And then a little bit later, I had another big problem that I had to solve when something very tragic happened to me in my life that changed everything. I graduated.
Okay.
I went to all these great schools and stuff, and I graduated, and I had to figure out, what do I do with my life? And I looked around, and from where I stood at that time, the art forms that I had spent my time, my days pursuing and perfecting were irrelevant, or so it seemed to me at that time.
Yeah.
And so I need to figure out, how do I build a career model? How do I find relevance and build a life for myself? And ultimately, those creative questions, I started trying really crazy things, and I started discovering that a lot of other people are asking very similar questions. And that really led me toward the world of innovation and entrepreneurship.
Well, that's an amazing story. Particularly, I think that's great. And it's really interesting that since you were a child, like you said, you were playing all this music, and your mother were like, "Hey, that's not what it says. Just accomplish the plan," like attached to it. But since that moment, you already had that creativity on yourself. And I think that's really interesting. And the next question is, what do you think about all these people, like young people, that sometimes they are creatives, but sometimes some circumstances, like maybe sometimes parents or laboral things or their lives, different opportunities, uh, does not help to improve that creativity. Like there's a lot of people who are creative since day one, but sometimes they need to stop being creative because they need just to follow orders, stuff like that. They can't be really creative on their areas, but then years later they can actually do it. Then they find themselves realizing that all those time they could be creative.
Yeah, creativity, I think there's this misunderstanding that creativity is just about anarchy and everything goes, and it's something you have or you don't. You're a
Right.
creative person or you're not a creative person. Ideation, when it comes to innovation or creativity, coming up with fresh ideas is an important part of the process, but it's only one part of the process.
Okay.
So I think a lot of this is about balance. There was a time where there was this movement that was thinking about creativity. Our kids are not being creative. So here's what we need to do. We shouldn't tell them how to spell words.
Right.
What we're going to let them do is be creative. Just sound it out. How does it feel like it should be spelled? And the result of that is we now have a generation of kids that can't spell. Right? It wasn't really effective at what they set out to do, creativity is not just about imagination.
Okay.
That's a part of it, but sometimes it's about going through the steps and getting things done. And that's one of the things in my background that I'm so grateful for, because in classical music there's a lot of focus about attention to details and the pursuit of excellence and paying attention to everything and developing an ironclad work ethic. And then jazz was about taking something and walking the tightrope and finding your own voice. And it's the balance of those two things that I think are really needed if we want to become creative problem solvers in ways that are relevant to us personally and to our own communities.
Okay. Well, like, um, you were talking about music, and I think that's really interesting. In some other interviews, we spoke about how art it's a process that we can use to increase sometimes our creativity, but not just like if you do a lot of art, of music, painting, whatever, you will increase your creativity. We were talking about this subject about sometimes our mind, it's like it's tired because of stress, because of daily problems, because traffic, a lot of things. And sometimes art helps to open that door of creativity. Like, yeah, of course, it will help you to, it's like a discipline and you will improve with the practice, but sometimes that opens that door to creativity. So, can you talk about that in your personal life with music?
Well, I would just say, and I love that you're thinking about things that way. Like anything else in life, it's not just about the discipline, it's about the approach, right? Because it is true that art of all different kinds of forms can be a way to enhance creativity, but taught another way, it can actually kill creativity. So, for example, in classical music training, the goal is to play some other creative genius came up with all the right notes, all the right rhythms, all the right dynamics and articulation, all these things. And your job as a performer is to realize their vision, their creative vision. And if there is any room for creativity, it's just tinkering around the edges, but not big, large scale, bold reimagination. So not only is it not teaching people to be innovators, but it is teaching them to not innovate. And similarly, I saw in northern Thailand, they have a college program. You can get a 4-year degree in this, in copying art.
Okay.
And so what they'll do is they'll look at a National Geographic magazine cover, for example, or a photograph from a camera, and they'll draw it with pencils. And it's amazing. It's like classical music.
Uh-huh.
It's amazing. It's impressive to look at. I don't know if it's creative, but it's applying a technique.
Right.
And so, I think everything is in balance. It is important to develop technique, because if you don't have that, your creativity will only go so far. But on the other hand, if you're only focused on technique, then you're not going to have the chops to really make meaningful creative discoveries. I would say the same thing about learning math. Math can be incredible, or learning business, or learning anything. It could be creative, but the problem is so much of the time in math class, we teach to the test, get the right answer. So much of the time in music class, we teach to the concert, play the right note.
Uh-huh.
So if you want any discipline to really, if creativity is the goal, the process is important. Pedagogical priorities are important. And I would guess any topic could really enhance creativity, and any topic could diminish creativity depending on how it is approached.
Love it. Love it. Totally. I totally agree. And so before we start the interview, we were talking about creativity and game. So let's talk about that,
Sure.
please.
So, for a long time, with all kinds of sectors, the arts, businesses, education, government, I've been running these experiences that always have a central problem to solve, and they're usually team-based. And I really didn't know, what is it that we're doing? Is this a retreat? Well, no, it doesn't feel relaxing like that. Is it a boot camp? Is it is it just design thinking? And one day I recognized, working with a colleague, what we were really doing is playing a game. And by gamifying problem solving, it changed everything, and it brought this whole methodology uh, into clarity. So first of all, I consider any process that is organized and thought through to be a game, whether or not it's particularly gamey.
Uh-huh.
So you don't need dice and concept cards in order to solve a problem. And yet, think of the benefits of unapologetic gamification. You know, when you're playing a game, there is accountability to rules and results. You know what
Mhm.
wins, you know what loses. Oftentimes in games, people are willing to be more collaborative and more creative, take chances more than they would in real life.
Right.
And
Right.
though playing games is fun, and so the problems that we are trying to solve might be very serious. They could be life and death. I'm living in South Carolina. We just had this terrible hurricane that came through. This is really important, and yet to figure out how to get back on our feet, a good game might actually deliver some innovative responses that just sitting around in a different format might not generate. So you can really build a game around any type of problem. And GAME is actually an acronym that stands for Guidelines, Arena, Materials, and Experience. So it's a whole methodology that comes out of that.
Well, that's so interesting because a few weeks ago we were talking about how can we use creativity in a better way to solve problems, and we were discussing about sometimes it's better to be like not to be like a fool, but sometimes act like like you were a small child, like just playing games. Sometimes you don't care about that, like you just go ahead and try your best and like you don't take it so seriously.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's the thing. Sometimes we are drowning on a glass of water, and maybe we could solve the problem in so many ways, but we are taking it so serious, and sometimes we just have to flow and to play. But I think this is really interesting because now we are talking about solving problems and improving and helping sometimes companies or stuff like that by using this methodology about games. Like you said, there are rules, you follow steps, you win or you lose, you know what to do, you take risks, and I think that's really interesting. Like that's a new thing for me, and I think it's really interesting.
Hey, when a lot of organizations or individuals go to solve a problem, they just ask one question. Here's the problem. What should we do?
Uh-huh.
Call it the one-stop flop.
Yeah.
But essentially, the idea is if I just ask an open ended question, what should we do? Well, you could do anything, and somehow that will get us to the creative solution. And in my experience, the answer is going to be no, it's not going to get you there.
Uh-huh.
Because the road to everywhere leads to surprisingly few destinations.
Mhm.
When everything is possible, people just come up with the most obvious thing. And this is true on an individual level. Like, you're a student thinking about, well, what should I do with my life? What should I do? Like my existential crisis too. What should I
Yeah.
do with my career? Well, we're only going to think of the obvious things. And that's not a great game. Whereas a game is more sophisticated than that. When I design a game, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I have no idea what the solution is going to be. But I spent a lot of time, first of all, figuring out what is the most important question that we're asking. And then what are the steps along the way that are going to open up our minds in ways that they wouldn't without this game. Many games that I run are multi-team games. So you might have 8 teams of 8, 10 people, or whatever it is. Or there could be bigger teams, smaller teams, more teams, fewer teams. Sometimes it's a tournament. So you have different teams that are all solving the same problem, but hopefully they'll go in different directions. So one of the strategies I often like to use, because I don't want to go through a process, and sometimes you ask questions and you get 4 out of 7 teams all come up with the same idea, which either means it's a brilliant idea or it's an obvious idea.
Uh-huh.
So to build in parts of the process, part of the game experience, E is for experience. So to build part of the experience that forces teams to think differently, that imposes a constraint. So for example, you could say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. But for one team, you might say, how would you solve this problem if you had to spend at least $1 million on it? And they were only thinking about spending $472. And then you ask someone else, how would you solve this problem if you only had $6 to spend on it? And how would you solve this problem if the only rule were you had to get in the Guinness Book of World Records or something like that? By having these constraints imposed, it forces people to think differently.
Mm-hmm.
That's where sometimes creative genius comes from.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a really good way of discovering creativity, like the name of the podcast. That's really interesting. And this comes to my mind. Is there any way to find the difference between a brilliant idea or an obvious idea?
Well, that's a really interesting question. One of the things, well, here's one way to test it. Let's say you have a bunch of teams that are working on a question, and you can look at the different things that they brainstorm. And if every team comes up with something, it means it's probably pretty obvious.
Uh-huh.
And just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's bad.
Right.
And if two teams come up with it and no one else, maybe it means it's somewhat unique. But and if only one team comes up with it, it means at least in this community, only one person or entity is thinking about it. But what I love to do and to look at when you do a brainstorm is to say, all right, you have 10 teams, you work on this, you go through all these things, and then look at it, what do none of us have?
Mm-hmm.
Because if your list, if at least one person in this room came up with the idea of this kind of thing, it means at least within the collective consciousness, one person is thinking in that way. But if 0 people came up with it, it means there could be a blinder. And with anything like this, there will always be things that aren't on the list. You can't get everything on your list.
Right.
And so, I guess we'd have to come up with an example and figure out what it is. But for example, a lot of times, maybe if I were talking to a group of educators and how might you approach this and make it engaging idea, and maybe engaging pedagogy or something like that. And they'll come up with all these great ideas, and you look at it and you notice not a single person has mentioned virtual reality or roller coasters or whatever it is, and that might be what's really exciting about it and the direction to explore. So that could be a great thing. Everyone brainstorm. Okay, now we're only allowed to select things that didn't come on to anyone's.
Okay.
What should we do? That's interesting. I never did that before.
Yeah, that's a really interesting exercise, and I think we could have a really interesting answers in that kind of situation. So, talking about your job, your daily life, and all this that we're talking about, this methodology, way of thinking, and lifestyle, can you share with us? Do you have any story to share where you, in your job or in your daily life, maybe, have you used this methodology to solve maybe one problem, or have you helped somebody else using this way of thinking?
Sure. All the time. That's one of the main things I do is go work with organizations to solve problems. So do you want a personal example, or do you want an example of working with an organization?
Well, if you have 2 stories, we have time for both.
Cool. Well, I'll give you a personal one. One of the things that I try to do is to always think of when you hit a wall,
Mm-hmm.
how can you come up with a better solution than if you didn't hit it?
Okay.
Right? And so, I want to talk just for a second about COVID-19
Uh-huh.
because, I am an innovator to my core, yet I am not nearly as creative as COVID. Like, I look at COVID as a worthy adversary, because I could never have imagined a world in which we had to stand 6 to 12 feet apart. We had to wear Darth Vader masks and all these things all the time. Like, it just never dawned on me.
Right.
So I think when we hit COVID, a lot of people just didn't It was like life was over. They didn't know what to do. And I was determined at that moment, we have to do something extraordinary, something better than we would have done had it not been for COVID. So this is, I'm going to talk about a music hat, then I can talk about a non-musical thing. But just to give that, so I work at a university, and so we work in a music unit, and so we went through a musical game to arrive at this. But one of the things at that moment in time, when you think about music, every concert venue worldwide was closed. So we didn't have any work to do for live performance. We couldn't even be in the same room as collaborators. And there was a real question of, what does the world need from us now? Because we can't give you a shot. We can't cure you if you get this plague.
Right.
So what does the world need for us to do? And so ultimately, after going through this process, we came up with this initiative that was super amazing, called Celebrating Local Heroes. But what we recognized is that music so this is a university story, just as a framework, and I'm telling you because you're also at a university. So what we realized, that music is really good at building community and telling stories and bringing attention to certain things. So we went through a process, identified 10 professions that were on the front lines of COVID,
Okay.
like teachers and nurses and truck drivers and grocery workers, restaurant employees, things, the custodians, things like that, people that were really the most important people in the world at that moment. We worked with partners across the state to help us identify a local hero who would be kind of the face for it.
Okay.
We paired each hero with a composer and an ensemble. And we did a few things. We interviewed them with a video company and made these short video vignettes that were scored by the composer and recorded by the ensemble. We programmed around town 10 site-specific concerts in places that were meaningful to each of the heroes outside, aboard something called the concert truck, which was actually an entrepreneurial invention of a student of mine several years before, who said, wouldn't it be cool if there was a concert truck, with a piano on it, a box truck with a piano on it, not knowing that at one point performances through a concert truck would be the only way to safely experience music in the world. So their careers exploded during COVID.
Wow.
They went viral. No, that's too soon. during COVID, and that's when they really made it big.
Okay.
So we brought them down. We did all these concerts. There were a number of other things. We had a community conversation with all 10 of the heroes, and did other things. But it is something that we never imagined doing, that particular thing. And it was only because we couldn't do what we normally did that it forced us to think of something extraordinary. And we got all kinds of press because of it, and made a documentary, all things like that. And I think if you ask a lot of educational institutions, well, what was the best thing that came out of COVID? They would say, well, we learned how to use Zoom, which I'm glad it took an international pandemic for many of us to learn to use readily available technology.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm so glad that we don't say that we have a better answer to that question. Yeah. And I just wanted people to be able to look back and say, remember that COVID period? That was amazing. Not to diminish all of the bad things that happened, but I'm so proud of what we did, as opposed to, you remember that COVID period? I just want to forget about those 2 years. Like, I want to write off 2 years of my life. Well, what kind of life is that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting, and that flows like the thing that sometimes we learn about experience. We learn about problems. We learn about mistakes, and I think that's great. Like, some people, like you said, want to forget the COVID, but what if, like you said it, what if we look to the other point, and what did I learn during that time? What experience I have now, and what I change? Like, sometimes, like, some people are talking about psychology and all those subjects. They see life in a different way. Some people lost maybe a family member or somebody who loved, and now they see life in a different way. They appreciate the small things, the details, and I mean, that's great. Like, what can I learn from this experience, and how can I use it now on in my life?
Yeah. Let no crisis go to waste. And I don't want to diminish any of those horrible
Oh
things
no,
that, because they were very real
sure,
and have
sure,
very real cost.
yeah,
But let no crisis go to waste.
yeah. Of course, we can't change what we lived, but we can change what we are going to live now on in the future.
We make a choice
Yeah.
every morning, every day, with every issue. And for me, the terms problem and opportunity are synonyms,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you face a challenge, you face an opportunity. And they don't, it doesn't mean it's going to be fun. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but there's opportunity in just about everything.
That's
And
right. Totally agree with you. Totally agree. That's right. So now, do you have any? You we were talking earlier about steps and about rules. Do you have like any process, or can you share with us, like in a few words, this kind of process, if you have one, to solve problems with the game or with this creativity subject that we're talking about?
Sure. So usually, I mean, I have lots of games that I've written about lots of different things, but just even a. So as we talked about, creative ideation is only one part of the problem-solving process.
Okay.
Right. Also important are, this is actually a book of mine called The Game of Innovation. It talks,
Okay.
and it's an illustrated, full color book because I wanted not only to talk about innovation, but for it to look like innovation. I don't know how to hold it up so you can kind of
Yeah.
see
Okay. That's great.
how it looks like that. And so it has a lot of different techniques and talks through the process. One of the tools I talk about in this book are 5 lenses of problem solving, which are different it's not about, there are lots of ways to answer any question, but what lens are we wearing at this moment? And when you're working with a team, how do you get everyone in your team to be answering the same question? Because what often happens when you're problem solving is someone has an idea, someone loves that idea, someone hates that idea. Someone said we did that 10 years ago, and someone else says, yeah, we should do that. Let's do that now. Those are all essential parts of the problem solving process, but not at the same time.
Okay.
That's the key. And so you have to know, is this a moment for research?
Mm.
Is this a moment for creativity and coming up with new ideas? Is this a moment for positive feedback and reinforcement? Is this a moment for negative critique? Is this a moment for making a decision? So they're different, and there's a different chapter in there on each of these perspectives and some tools for each of them. And so I've invented this system where there are these 5 lenses of innovation. Each one is a different color.
Mm.
And the first letter of the color stands for the first letter of another perspective that goes along with it. So P is for the purple lens is for proposing, for example.
Okay.
And that's the creative ideas, coming up with ideas, imagination lens. And when you're proposing, that's not the time to be critiquing. It's not the time to be stating the way the world is or to make a decision. It's just about coming up with as many ideas as you can. Or the blue lens is about boosting affirmation, or the orange lens is about owning, making a decision at the expense of 1,000 others. And so some people are inherently, they actually come up with lots of decisions, or they come up with lots of ideas, but they can't decide which one to do because they look small. That's a different part, and that's not going to get you there. There are other people that just want to do one thing, but they don't have any big ideas. So you need all of them, either within yourself or within a team. That's why diverse teams are very helpful, because different people are better at different parts of the process. I can just tell you another easy process or exercise. I mean, let me talk about something I call Q variations.
Okay.
So oftentimes when we want to solve a problem, the question we ask is just, how do we solve this problem? And then we come up with the obvious answer. So one thing you can do with Q variations, the notion is that you come up with 10 ways or 20 ways or 50 ways to ask the question before you even get to the solution, to ask the question. And how you ask the question impacts the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us ask boring questions, and as a result, we get boring answers. But if you ask a creative question, you might get to a creative answer. If you ask a intriguing or a crazy question, you might get to an intriguing or a crazy answer. So suppose you want to go on vacation this summer. Most of us just say, where should we go on vacation? And then we say, I don't know, Disney.
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe Disney is great. But think about if you wanted to ask questions to get you to think in different ways. You could ask a question like, well, where might we go on vacation that I've always dreamed about going? Where might we dream about going on vacation that I've never thought about for a moment in my life? So you can ask a positive or a negative question.
Uh-huh.
Where should we go that I've met people before? What vacation options would involve high rises or chocolate or hats or cigars or or whatever it is? What vacation ideas have 3 syllables? And so you could do it with language, you could do it with features, you could do it with outcomes. What vacation ideas will help me develop a new skill? So there are so many great questions you could think about. And if you can come up with great questions, you're probably going to get a whole lot of different answers than if you just ask, where should we go this summer?
Yeah, that's so interesting, and I think that's really quite it's really cool because sometimes we just think about this way of thinking like when we are talking with some people, like, okay, so if you want to talk with some person but you don't want to start a discussion, you have to be like calm down, like take care of your volume, your intentions, your body language, all of this. But yeah, sometimes we just forget that we can use all this way of thinking to solve problems, to help to work in team, or in some other areas in our daily life. And I think that's really interesting. I loved the book that you showed to us, and I think that's really interesting. And I think it has a lot of quality and valuable information of all of this subject that we're talking about. So, is this new? Your book is really new?
It's a couple years old, about 1 or 2 years old.
Okay, so can you share with us your experience so far with this book, like writing a book? Is this your first book, or do you have more books?
I have a bunch of books. What was different about this book, uh, The Game of Innovation, is that it was a visual book.
Okay.
And so, I'm used to writing in a way that really connects to readers and that's very specific, but also tells stories. And but the interesting thing about a visual book, one is if you do it right, the image supports the words and the words support, so they clarify each other. And some people are visual learners, yet most books are word books only. The thing about words is you might have very good words or very funny words or very thought-provoking words, but when you have too many of them, they just look ugly, at least in a visual context. So a challenge for this book is, how do I still connect with readers and teach whatever the lesson is? This is not a 1-point book.
Right.
Sometimes there's books that it's like, here's one big idea. It's a really great idea, but you're going to read about the same thing over and over and over again. No, this is about many different things. It teaches a very comprehensive approach to innovation. And so I had to figure out, how can I do all of those things and really connect with readers and be clear in no words, or in very few words. And when I was working with the illustrator, so what I did when I created it, so I was working in Google Docs, and you see most books are portrait, this one's landscape, right? So I turned the page landscape, and I said, what's one page in Google Docs will be one page in the book. And so I was trying to be way more concise and short sentences, short paragraphs, more than I had ever done before. And then I showed it to the artist for the first time when we were working on it. And she's like, oh my God, David, you just go on and on and on. I'm like, what do you mean? This is my concise poetry. What are you talking about? And so she went through a passage, and she's like, slash, slash, slash. It's like, oh, wow, I can really do this a different way. That was a huge lesson. And I have a new book that's going to be coming out in summer.
Oh, great.
I've been working on that, and it's more visual than my other books, but it's not a picture book in
Okay.
the way this is. But it's really impacted the way that I write and convey ideas, and especially this notion. I think in school, in middle school, we learn this lesson. How do you say as little as you can in as many words as possible? Right? How do you say nothing but make it last for 6 pages, because they have page minimums? And I think in a lot of stages of creative process, innovation process, and just communicating, how do you take complex ideas and make them as simple as possible? State them in as few words as you can to still have the personality that you need them to have, but it shouldn't require reading a sentence 15 times to really understand, this zigzag and whatever it is. So to be able to just say what you want to say and get it out there and go on. So it's been really interesting.
Well, that's a great story, and I would like to ask you like how is it to work with an illustrator, like talking about trying new things. Like you just said, you have more books, but this was like the very first that it was like in a visual way. So this was a challenge also for you, right? Like in this aspect of open your mind, not your mind, but like yeah, trying new things. So how was that experience?
Well, it was amazing. I've worked with Patty Dobrowolski is the name of the artist. So there was a designer
Uh-huh.
and an artist.
Okay.
And she's like call her a graphic facilitator, a quick draw artist. So one thing we had done before that, now I met her, she's kind of a business partner, is we would go and we would play games or do workshops or whatever it is. And she would capture using visual drawings in real time, like the minutes of the meeting or, whatever we had done, just with images. And it's so much more engaging than, reading typed up notes from a meeting or something.
Right.
See a picture. So oftentimes it will be that balance of, a word or 3 words in the picture that gets the meaning across instead of just like paragraphs and paragraphs where you can't find anything. And so it was fun. It was hard. I had to really talk about what is the type of image that we need that's going to best emphasize whatever it is we're trying to address in this particular passage. So it was time consuming, but super fulfilling. And I'm so proud of how it came out. And it's just a joy. Most books, including most creative books, don't look very creative.
Uh-huh.
So hopefully we stand out from that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's great. And congratulations for for this book and for all your books. And I think that's really really interesting. Okay, so I have like this last final question for you, and this podcast will be seen by a lot of students, young people, and teachers. A lot of people, and we are trying to close, or at least myself, I'm trying to close every interview asking what would you like to say to these people in a way that you can give them like kind of an advice, maybe a phrase, a sentence, a life experience that you have lived that changed your life, that like you said, okay, this changed my life and I think this could help y'all. So like, do you have anything to say to every one of us?
Yeah, 2 things came to mind. One was just in terms of when you were just saying a saying, opportunities are, let me say a few things.
Yeah.
Opportunities are everywhere, but opportunities only belong to people who take them. And most people don't take the opportunities that are around them, right? Most people just do the obvious thing, right? A lot of people who are students, they think that the opportunity around them is to go to their classes and get straight A's and whatever it is. And a lot of times they're not taking advantage of like befriending their faculty members or, getting to know guest artists who are coming to campus or whatever it is. Opportunities are everywhere. Another belief of mine is that there are 100 solutions. Just about every problem is solvable. So I have a saying, dreams first, then logistics. Right? Start with the best case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually you can figure out a way to make it happen. And if it can't happen that way, then you can change what it is. So much of the time, I think we we say, how would we do this? How would I make an impact in the world? And we start, well, that can never happen because I live here. That costs too much money or whatever it is. It's just saying, what's the best possible outcome?
Okay.
And then building a path. Design your life, design your future instead of letting it design you.
Mhm.
When you asked about a personal anecdote, I'll give you another one everything's a metaphor. So I think creative people become masters of the metaphor. Most people look for role models who look and think kind of like they do.
Mhm.
So what's your major?
My major? Well, I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah. So a lot of times when graphic designers are looking for role models, they look to other graphic designers, and they might have some solutions, but a musician might have more answers for you than a graphic designer, and a graphic designer might have more answers for me, than a musician. Case in point, there's a musician and a graphic designer, right? So you got to get out of your silo to be able to do things. So I think just about every problem is solvable, and there are 100 solutions to any problem. So it seems to me most people either have a lot of ideas about their future or no idea, or one or two ideas. I've never met someone who had 7 ideas. Either you have 100 ideas or 1 or 2 or 0 ideas, not 5 ideas. Nobody's a little bit creative. You develop those skills or you don't. So I'll tell you the story that came to mind. As an undergraduate, I was writing for a big band for a certain kind of ensemble. And I'd written for it before, but I finally wrote this piece and it worked. Like the first time they read it, it was just perfect. And it just everything balanced, everything sounded great. And I was so excited because I felt like I know how to write for this group now. And then the teacher came to me and he said, this sounded great. It read itself down. But anybody who knows how to write for this ensemble could write a piece that sounds like this. What makes you you? What makes your writing for this group sound unlike anyone else? And that's what I would say. That changed my life.
Okay.
I'm sure my music or my perspective on life would freak him out and others. But for everyone, what makes you you? There are a lot of great graphic designers out there, but what is distinctive to the way that you will approach the world or the problems that you will solve?
Right.
So again, let me go to this to tie on with it. Maybe it's good. This is something for a lot of people. If you ask a lot of people what makes you good at what you do or not good at what you do, they can give you a whole, I'm good at this, I'm bad at that. If you ask people what makes you interesting, it's like deer in the headlights. What like makes you stand apart? What makes you the best in the world? Mm-hmm. If there are 500 business students or graphic design students or journalism, it doesn't matter what they do, or pharmacists, it doesn't matter what it is. What's interesting about you? Hopefully you're good. That should be a, bottom, not the top. That should be the bottom level goal. But what makes you distinctive, especially in a competitive world like we live in? What makes you stand out among everyone else?
Well, that was so good. Thank you so much for all those answers. I'm sure that it will help a lot of people, including myself, to be honest. And well, David, I had a great time talking with you. Unfortunately, this was all the time that we had today, but I learned a lot from you, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your lifestyle, your methodology, some parts of your personal life, about your childhood, about your life, your story, and thanks so much. Of course, we already said we have this podcast that talks about creativity, about increasing, about helping ourselves in so many ways, and definitely this episode it will be a great help for everybody. So, David, thanks so much. It was a pleasure. It was an honor to me to have this chat with you, and well, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. Pleasure was mine.
Thank you so much.